Let me start with something that changes the way you look at the entire dynamic. Sometimes the person an avoidant struggles with the most is not the person who demanded the most from them, but the person who made them feel the most. And that distinction matters because an avoidant can often manage distance. They can manage casual connections. They can manage relationships where emotional vulnerability remains limited and predictable. But when someone reaches a deeper part of them, something changes. Suddenly, the strategies that once protected them begin to create conflict. Think about what happens when you encounter someone who sees beyond your surface, someone who notices the hesitation behind your confidence, someone who recognizes when you're pulling away, not because you don't care, but because something inside you has become uncomfortable with caring too much. That kind of emotional recognition can feel incredibly intimate. And intimacy is precisely where the avoidant's internal conflict can become intense. They may want to be understood, but being understood also means being seen. They may crave connection, but connection creates vulnerability. They may want someone who accepts them completely, yet that acceptance can remove the protective distance they've depended upon for years. So when you became emotionally significant to them, you may have unintentionally challenged their entire system of emotional control. This is why you have to stop interpreting every withdrawal as proof that you meant nothing. Withdrawal can have many meanings. Sometimes it genuinely means disinterest. Sometimes it means incompatibility. And sometimes, particularly within an avoidant pattern, distance becomes a strategy for regulating emotional discomfort. The important question isn't, why did they run? The deeper question is, what did closeness with me require them to confront? Because when someone becomes emotionally important, avoidance becomes harder to maintain. They can no longer simply tell themselves this doesn't matter. Their emotional experience begins contradicting their intellectual narrative. They may tell themselves they need independence while simultaneously missing your presence. They may convince themselves that leaving was the rational decision while emotionally revisiting memories they thought they had buried. They may create distance because closeness feels overwhelming, only to discover that distance doesn't eliminate attachment, and that contradiction creates the emotional conflict. But here's where I want you to be careful. Don't romanticize their avoidance. Don't turn emotional unavailability into evidence of secret devotion. And don't convince yourself that their internal struggle automatically means they will change. Understanding psychology should give you clarity, not another reason to wait. Your responsibility is not to rescue someone from their defenses. Your responsibility is to recognize what the relationship revealed about you, about them, and about the kind of emotional connection you actually deserve. Because the moment you stop trying to control their response, something remarkable happens. You regain control of your own life. You stop asking, how can I make them feel safe enough to choose me? And you start asking, why am I choosing someone who cannot consistently meet me where I am? That is the shift from emotional obsession to emotional intelligence. You may have become their biggest emotional conflict because you touched a part of them they couldn't easily control. But your greatest victory is not becoming unforgettable to them. Your greatest victory is becoming unforgettable to yourself. And this is where the dynamic becomes even more interesting, because once you understand that you became emotionally significant to someone who relies on distance for regulation, you begin to understand the power of absence. Not the power of absence as a manipulation, not disappearing to make someone jealous, not withholding communication as a tactic. I'm talking about something much deeper. What happens psychologically when you stop filling the emotional space for another person. When you were constantly present, you may have been making it easier for them to avoid confronting their own feelings. You were there to explain, reassure, initiate, repair, forgive, and keep the connection alive. Every time they became distant, you may have moved closer. Every time they became uncertain, you may have provided certainty. And because you were doing all of that, they didn't necessarily have to experience the full consequences of their own withdrawal. But then something changes. You become quiet. You stop chasing. You stop sending the message that says, I'm still here. Please choose me. And suddenly they are left alone with the emotional consequences of their own decisions. This is important because people don't always recognize the value of something while they have constant access to it. Familiarity can create psychological blindness. When your presence becomes predictable, the mind can begin treating it as part of the environment rather than something valuable. But remove that presence and the brain has to update its model of reality. The person who is always available isn't available in the same way anymore. The conversations aren't happening. The reassurance isn't coming. The emotional safety they could access whenever they wanted is no longer guaranteed, and that's when memories can become louder. They may remember the small conversations they dismissed. They may remember how comfortable it felt to talk to you. They may remember moments when you understood them without forcing them to explain everything. They may remember the patience you showed, the emotional consistency you offered, or simply the feeling of being known. But here's the crucial distinction. Their realization is not your responsibility. You don't create distance so that someone will miss you. You create healthy distance when continuing to pursue someone is costing you your dignity, your peace, or your emotional stability. That distinction separates self-respect from manipulation. Because if your entire strategy is, I'm going silent so they will come back, you're still emotionally dependent on their response. But if your mindset becomes, I'm stepping back because I refuse to abandon myself, everything changes. Now your silence isn't a weapon, it's a boundary. And boundaries communicate something extraordinarily powerful without saying a word. You are free to make your choices, but I am also free to make mine. That's where personal power begins. You cannot force another person to confront their emotions. You cannot make someone become secure. You cannot love someone into emotional maturity, but you can stop protecting them from the consequences of avoiding intimacy. And sometimes that is the first moment they actually have to face themselves. Your absence may remind them of your value, but your growth reminds you of your own. Don't disappear to make them miss you. Step back to remember that you never needed to lose yourself to be loved. And now we arrive at one of the great paradoxes of avoidant psychology. Sometimes the distance they believe will bring them peace is the very distance that makes them realize what they have lost. Think about that for a moment. When someone feels overwhelmed by emotional closeness, creating space can feel like relief. The nervous system settles. The pressure seems to disappear. They can convince themselves that stepping back was the rational decision. They can return to familiar routines and tell themselves, this is better. I need my freedom. I don't need all of this emotional intensity. And for a while, they may genuinely believe it. But distance has a strange psychological effect. It removes the immediate discomfort of intimacy, but it also removes the person who was creating the emotional experience in the first place. That's where the paradox begins. They wanted less closeness, but now they have less connection. They wanted fewer expectations, but now there is nobody asking how they feel. They wanted emotional freedom, but suddenly that freedom contains silence. And silence can reveal things that distraction conceals. When you were close, their attention may have been focused on what felt uncomfortable about the relationship. They may have noticed the expectations, the vulnerability, the conversations they weren't ready to have, or the emotional responsibility they associated with intimacy. But once you are gone, the mind can begin focusing on something completely different, what your presence actually provided. Maybe you made them feel understood. Maybe you brought emotional warmth into their life. Maybe you challenged them intellectually. Maybe you gave them a sense of acceptance they rarely experienced. Maybe you simply made ordinary moments feel meaningful. And this is where memory becomes powerful. The human mind doesn't preserve every moment equally. Emotional experiences tend to remain psychologically significant because they carry meaning. So when the immediate relationship disappears, certain memories can become disproportionately important. They may remember your voice, a particular conversation, the way you looked at them when they were struggling, a moment when you understood something they couldn't articulate, a simple interaction that seemed insignificant at the time but feels different after the relationship has ended. Now, none of this means you should interpret every silence as hidden longing. That's dangerous thinking. Psychology should never become an excuse to create fantasies. Sometimes people leave because they don't want the relationship. Sometimes they leave because the relationship isn't healthy. And sometimes people with avoidant patterns genuinely need distance. But here's what matters for you. Their distance doesn't determine your value. If they eventually recognize what your presence meant, that is their realization to carry. Your job is not to stand at the door waiting for them to discover your worth. Your job is to continue building a life that does not depend on someone else's emotional readiness. Because there is a philosophical lesson here that goes far beyond attachment styles. We often understand value through absence. We understand health after illness. We understand peace after chaos. We understand someone's importance after their voice is no longer part of our daily life. But emotionally mature people don't need to lose something permanently before appreciating it. That's the standard you should hold. If someone needs your absence to recognize your presence, let them learn that lesson without sacrificing yourself in the process. Because you don't prove your value by becoming impossible to live without. You prove your value by refusing to abandon yourself just because someone else is afraid to come closer. And once you understand what happens when distance exposes the value of your presence, we can go even deeper. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you did was not simply make an avoidant miss you. You challenged the story they had built about relationships, intimacy, and themselves. Every human being carries an internal philosophy about connection. We develop assumptions about what love means, what closeness costs, what vulnerability leads to, and whether other people can actually be trusted. These beliefs don't always exist consciously. Often, they operate underneath the surface, quietly directing behavior. An avoidant pattern can be connected with beliefs such as, I am safer when I depend on myself. People eventually disappoint you. Too much closeness means losing your freedom. Or, if I let someone get too close, they will eventually hurt me. Now, here's where you become a conflict. You may have entered their life and behaved differently from the story they expected. You may have been emotionally available without demanding that they surrender their independence. You may have listened without immediately judging. You may have given them space without abandoning them. You may have shown affection without turning vulnerability into weakness. And suddenly their internal philosophy encounters contradictory evidence. That's uncomfortable, because human beings don't like having their deepest assumptions challenged. We prefer consistency. If someone believes relationships are dangerous, they unconsciously notice evidence that relationships are dangerous. If they believe dependence equals weakness, they may interpret normal emotional needs as threats. But then someone comes along who doesn't fit the model. Someone says, you can be close to me and still be yourself. Someone demonstrates vulnerability doesn't have to destroy your independence. Someone shows being understood doesn't mean being controlled. Now, the mind has a problem. The old belief says one thing, the lived experience says another, and that creates cognitive and emotional tension. This is one reason a meaningful relationship can feel more threatening to an avoidant person than a superficial relationship. A superficial connection doesn't require the internal system to change. It allows the person to remain exactly who they believe they are. But deep connection asks a more difficult question. What if the way you've been protecting yourself is also preventing you from experiencing what you actually want? That's a profound question, because a defense mechanism can protect you from pain while simultaneously protecting you from intimacy. The wall doesn't know the difference. It keeps danger out, but it can also keep love out. And that's why you should never assume that someone's withdrawal automatically means you did something wrong. Sometimes your emotional availability simply brought them face to face with a part of themselves they had successfully avoided. But, and this is critical, you cannot dismantle someone else's psychological defenses for them. You can demonstrate healthy communication. You can demonstrate consistency. You can demonstrate boundaries. You can create an environment where honesty is possible. But you cannot do their inner work. That belongs to them. Your role is not to become their therapist, emotional rehabilitation program, or proof that relationships can work. Your role is to remain honest about what you need. Because there's another philosophical truth here. Love does not require you to participate in someone's self-deception. If someone says they want connection but repeatedly chooses distance, believe the behavior. If someone says they care but consistently treats you without consideration, pay attention. If someone claims to want intimacy but refuses every opportunity for emotional responsibility, don't spend your life explaining their contradictions. Understanding someone does not mean excusing them. Compassion does not mean abandoning your standards. And psychological insight does not require self-sacrifice. In fact, the healthiest response may be to step back and allow another person to confront their own beliefs without your constant intervention. Because sometimes the greatest challenge you present to an avoidant isn't your pursuit, it's your boundaries. You quietly demonstrate that love can be offered without being begged for, and that closeness can exist without control, but also that access to you is not guaranteed. And if losing your presence forces them to question an old belief, that's their journey. You don't need to supervise it. You simply need to keep walking forward. Because ultimately, The goal isn't to become the person who finally convinces an avoidant that love is safe. The goal is to become the person who knows that healthy love should never require you to betray yourself. And this brings us to the deepest contradiction of all. An avoidant can genuinely want you and still struggle to let you close enough to matter. That sounds irrational, doesn't it? But human beings are not purely rational creatures. We don't simply pursue what we want and avoid what we don't want. We often move toward what we desire and away from what we fear at the exact same time. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, intimacy can represent both reward and threat. They may want companionship, affection, understanding, and emotional connection. But when those things become real, another part of them may become activated. Suddenly, the relationship isn't just about enjoying another person. It becomes about being seen, needing someone, being accountable, communicating honestly, and allowing another human being to have emotional significance. And that can feel dangerous. So you have to understand the difference between wanting someone and being ready for someone. Wanting is an emotion. Readiness is a capacity. Someone can miss you without knowing how to communicate with you. They can love aspects of you without knowing how to build a healthy relationship. They can fear losing you while simultaneously creating the very distance that could cause them to lose you. That is the paradox. And this is where many people become trapped. They see the contradiction and think if they are struggling this much, then they must love me deeply. If I can just be patient enough, understanding enough, supportive enough, eventually they will choose me. But that's where compassion can turn into self-abandonment. You cannot measure someone's capacity for a relationship by the intensity of their feelings alone. Feelings matter, but behavior matters more. A person can have powerful emotions and still be incapable of offering consistency. A person can miss you and still refuse to communicate. A person can fear losing you and still avoid commitment. A person can care about you and still make choices that hurt you. This is why emotional maturity requires us to hold two truths simultaneously. Yes, they may be struggling internally. And yes, I still deserve healthy treatment. You don't have to choose between empathy and self-respect. Now think about what may happen internally when you become deeply important to an avoidant person. The relationship begins to carry consequences. Your opinion matters. Your disappointment matters. Your absence matters. Their behavior affects someone they genuinely care about. And suddenly, emotional closeness has stakes. That's when vulnerability becomes unavoidable. Because intimacy means allowing another person to influence your emotional world. If they matter, they can hurt you. If they matter, you can disappoint them. If they matter, you can lose them. And for someone whose protective strategy is built around minimizing emotional dependence, that possibility can trigger retreat. They may create arguments over small issues. They may become emotionally unavailable. They may suddenly need more space. They may intellectualize the relationship instead of feeling it. They may focus on flaws that previously didn't bother them. Why? Because the mind sometimes looks for a rational explanation for an emotional threat. If I can convince myself this relationship isn't right, I don't have to confront how vulnerable I feel. That's the internal conflict. But here's the part that matters most for you. You don't solve this conflict by becoming smaller. You don't become less emotional so they won't feel overwhelmed. You don't eliminate your needs so they won't feel pressured. You don't become endlessly available so they never have to experience the possibility of losing you. And you certainly don't spend your life proving that you're safe enough to love. Healthy connection requires two people who are willing to participate. So if they move towards you, watch what they do. Do they communicate more honestly? Do they take responsibility? Do they become more consistent? Do they respect your boundaries? Do they demonstrate emotional growth through behavior? Those are the signs that matter. Not hidden meanings, not imagined signals, not occasional moments of affection, surrounded by prolonged withdrawal. You don't need to decode someone forever. You need to observe whether their actions create the kind of relationship in which you can actually thrive. Because the deepest lesson here is not about making an avoidant finally surrender to love. It's about refusing to confuse someone's fear of losing you with their ability to love you well. They may want you deeply, but you deserve someone who is also ready to meet you deeply. And now we arrive at the final transformation, because everything we've discussed leads to this moment. What happens when you stop measuring your worth by whether the avoidant comes back and start measuring your life by how fully you are living it? This is where your growth becomes the most powerful mirror. Not because you are trying to make them jealous, Not because you're posting a better life online so they will notice. Not because you're suddenly pretending you don't care. Real growth is much quieter than that. Real growth is when you no longer need someone else's emotional availability to feel emotionally secure within yourself. Think about what happens when you stop waiting. At first, there may be discomfort. You're used to checking your phone, replaying conversations, analyzing their behavior, wondering whether their silence means something, and imagining what they might be thinking. But eventually, something shifts. You begin investing that mental energy back into yourself. You start asking different questions. Not, what are they feeling? But, what am I building? Not, when will they come back? But, where am I going? Not, how do I make them understand what they lost? No, but, why did I ever believe their recognition was required for me to know my value? That is emotional freedom. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the moment you genuinely stop trying to influence someone is the moment they can finally see you clearly. When you're constantly pursuing, explaining, persuading, or seeking reassurance, the other person may experience you primarily through emotional pressure. But when you step back and become grounded, they encounter something different. They see a person who has a life, a person with boundaries, a person who can love without begging, a person who can care without chasing, a person who can walk away without hatred. That kind of transformation is powerful because it changes the psychological equation. You are no longer saying, please choose me. You are saying, through your behavior, I choose myself too. And that doesn't mean you stop caring. It means caring no longer requires self-abandonment. That's an enormous distinction because many people confuse attachment with devotion. They believe that if they keep giving, keep forgiving, keep waiting, and keep understanding, eventually their sacrifice will produce love. But sacrifice does not guarantee reciprocity. Sometimes sacrifice simply teaches another person that you will tolerate less than you deserve. Your growth changes that pattern. You begin establishing standards. You become more selective about who receives your time. You stop negotiating against yourself. You stop accepting inconsistency simply because someone occasionally gives you intensity. And you begin understanding that peace is not boring. Consistency is not weakness. Healthy communication is not neediness. Emotional availability is not desperation. These are signs of maturity. And if the avoidant notices this transformation, they may experience their own internal reaction. They may wonder why you're no longer responding the way you used to. They may recognize that your attention is no longer guaranteed. They may begin reflecting on decisions they previously made without fully considering their consequences. But again, don't make their reaction your destination. That's the final trap. If your growth is secretly designed to make them regret losing you, you're still organizing your life around them. True transformation has no hidden agenda. You become healthier because you want to be healthier. You become stronger because you want to be stronger. You build your life because your life matters whether they return or not. And if they eventually come back, you evaluate the situation from a completely different position. You don't ask, do they still want me? You ask, can they meet me at the level of emotional maturity I've developed? That's power, because now you're not choosing from fear of losing them. You're choosing from clarity. And perhaps that's the greatest mirror you can become. Not someone who makes them suffer, not someone they can never forget, but someone who refuses to lose themselves in the process of being loved. Because at the end of this entire journey, the avoidance emotional conflict is their responsibility. Your transformation is yours. And the moment you understand that, you stop waiting for someone else to validate the life you're capable of creating. Let them confront what they lost. Your job is to become someone you never again lose. So when you step back and look at the entire picture, you begin to understand something far more profound than whether an avoidant misses you, regrets losing you, or eventually comes back. You may have become their biggest emotional conflict because you represented something they couldn't easily control, genuine intimacy. Your presence challenged their defenses. Your absence exposed your value. Your connection questioned beliefs they had built around independence and vulnerability. Their desire for you collided with their fear of needing you. And eventually your growth forced the most uncomfortable realization of all, that you were never the person they could control through distance. But listen carefully, because this is where your power begins. Do not turn their internal conflict into your lifelong responsibility. You don't need to rescue them from their fears. You don't need to decode every silence. You don't need to analyze every message, every withdrawal, every return, or every moment of emotional uncertainty. And you certainly don't need to put your life on pause, waiting for someone to become ready. Maybe they will reflect. Maybe they will recognize what they lost. Maybe they will eventually confront the patterns that kept them from receiving the connection they wanted. But that journey belongs to them. Your journey is different. Your journey is learning that love should never require you to abandon yourself, because the real victory isn't making an avoidant chase you. The real victory isn't becoming unforgettable. The real victory isn't watching someone regret their decision. The real victory is reaching a place where you can say, I love deeply, I gave honestly, I learned profoundly, and I still chose myself. That's emotional strength. That's maturity. And that's freedom. So if you're sitting here wondering whether they still think about you, whether they miss you, or whether they finally understand your value, bring the question back to yourself. Do you understand your value? Do you understand that you don't need someone else's avoidance to question your worth? Do you understand that someone else's inability to receive love does not make your love less valuable? And do you understand that being rejected, ignored, or emotionally distanced from does not mean you were not enough? Sometimes the relationship wasn't meant to teach you how to hold on. Sometimes it was meant to teach you how to let go without losing yourself. So stop chasing closure from someone who couldn't give you consistency. Stop demanding answers from someone who may not even understand their own behavior. Stop trying to prove that you were worth choosing. You were never supposed to spend your life auditioning for love. Stand where you are. Take everything this experience taught you. Keep your compassion, but strengthen your boundaries. Keep your capacity to love, but stop giving it to people who repeatedly demonstrate that they cannot meet you there. And if one day they return, don't ask only whether they missed you. Ask whether they've changed. Don't listen only to what they promise. Watch what they consistently do, because words can reveal intention. Behavior reveals capacity. And finally, remember this. You may have become their biggest emotional conflict because you awakened feelings they weren't prepared to confront. But they do not get to become your biggest emotional conflict. You get to choose peace. You get to choose growth. You get to choose yourself. And when you finally do, something changes forever. You stop asking, why couldn't they love me the way I deserved? And you start saying, I will never again abandon myself just to be chosen by someone else.